All right, so good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse. Oh, there's that class I told you about. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those who don't know, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Today's Hangout features a little bit of all three of those, which is great. So we are joined right now by 7 classes from across North America. So I'm going to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out. We've got Miss Bork's grade 6s in Calgary, Alberta. Right, good start of enthusiasm. I like it. We've got Miss Saldivar's grade 2s in Anaheim, California. We've got Miss Burkett's grade 3s in Sterling, Virginia. When they break the mic, that's a good sign. We've got Miss Horner's grade 6s in Milton, Ontario. Oh. Wow, that bar is set very high. Milton just won. Okay, we've got Mr. Van Butte, 2 kids homeschooled in Kitchener, Ontario, grade 9. Hi, guys. Hi. Hi. Don't expect you to be yelling as loud as the rest. That's okay. We've got Miss Maxwell's grade 6s in DeWitt, Michigan. Hi, guys. Hi. You guys are so low pitched. I like it. We could do like a choir with a group of you. Maybe we will. And then Miss Woods' class just joined us, grade 5, 6s in Toronto, Ontario. Hi, guys. Right. Of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live by Dr. Paul Sokoloff. He is a botanist at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and he went on a trip to an expedition to the Western Arctic in 2010, and is so hooked that he is now a veteran of 9 Arctic expeditions, which he's going to tell us a little bit about today and give us an understanding of why someone would go to the Arctic to look for plants, which is not what most of us would think. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Paul, and take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jesse. I'm super happy to be here, and I'm so excited to be joined by classes from across North America, especially Calgary. I have to give a shout out because I actually grew up in Red Deer, so not too far away. I'm very excited about that. Anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Arctic. Unfortunately, here in Ottawa, where I'm based, we are trapped in Arctic temperatures. That's okay. I guess it sets the mood well. But I'm going to show you a little bit about it because I realize that most people don't have a good concept of what the Arctic is like. So why don't we start by placing the scene? So I'm just going to get this set up. We are going to share this screen, which apparently I'm good at. Thank you, Jesse. All right. So this is plants and lichens from the top of Canada. And you can probably see here that the top of Canada looks, well, it's pretty big. It's a very big place. In fact, the Arctic part of Canada, which is everything above the tree line, is 40% of Canada's landmass. This is millions of square kilometers with not a tree in sight except for very small Arctic willows. So I'm a botanist. Now, what exactly does a botanist do? Well, unlike what my mother thinks, I don't arrange flowers for a living. That's what a florist does, not a botanist. But you can see after about 3 weeks in the field, I might put a plant on my head because I may have gone a little stir crazy after being far out on the land, doing nothing but hiking and collecting plants. So what does a botanist do exactly? Well, I spend most of my time thinking about what plant species are. So if you've ever gone on a nature hike, you probably, you see, oh, that's a tree, okay, and oh, that's a different type of tree. Well, how do we tell them apart? Well, we look really closely at the leaves. Maybe, a maple tree is different from an oak, and you can tell based on the shape of their leaves. But what if you got even further detail down and you started to look with a microscope? You see all sorts of difference between those species. And those differences between the species are what my job is. I work here at the Canadian Museum of Nature, and so that's that castle that you see up on the screen. We also have a research facility, which is just below the castle. Spend most of my time there. I don't get to work in the castle as much as would be really cool to do. And I think about, okay, what's the difference between different types of plants? And I spend a lot of time doing this. Now, so you know what I do. You know what a botanist does. Let's talk about what the Arctic is. So if you think about the Arctic, this is probably what your imagination brings to mind. You've got this big towering iceberg, and you've got this boatload of Arctic tourists coming to see the iceberg. Well, yeah, no, that's true. That is an important part of the Arctic. And in fact, this is a shot from a Students on Ice expedition, which you may or may not have heard about, and I'm happy to talk about later on. But the Arctic is also varied in how it looks. And in fact, it's not winter all the time up north. It does winter for most of the year, but for 6 short, glorious weeks of Arctic summer, you get plants as far as the eye can see. And in fact, you can see, if you look on the bottom right, that's Victoria Island in the Western Arctic. You can see pretty far. In fact, it looks a little bit like Saskatchewan, has a bit of Canadian humor in there. But there's all sorts of different Arctic landscapes. And in each of those different landscapes, there's all sorts of different Arctic plants. So I mentioned that everything above the tree line, a botanist considers to be Arctic. This is what that looks like on a map of Canada. 40% of our landmass is above the tree line. 40% of it is Arctic, which is a huge area when you think that not many people have actually had a chance to go there, unfortunately. Another important thing about the Arctic is that a lot of people have it in their mind that this place that people go to and do a lot of exploration. But the truth is, it's a homeland. It's the Inuit homeland, and it has been for thousands of years. So we're very fortunate to be able to work with a lot of communities like Arviat and Kugluktuk, which you see displayed here, when we're working in Inuit Nunavut, which is the Inuktitut term for the Inuit homeland. And in Canada, that comprises 4 different regions. Nunavut in northern Labrador, Nunavut, which is Labrador and northern Quebec, Nunavut, which is Canada's newest territory, being founded in 1999, and the Inuvialuit settlement region in Northwest Territories and the Western Arctic. So across all of these different landscapes above the tree line, you'll find about 800 different plant species, everything from this little saxifrage to all sorts of different colorful, tiny tundra plants. Now, how do we know that there are about 800 different plant species that grow in the Canadian Arctic? Well, we know because we've spent a lot of time looking at it under a microscope or maybe sequencing the DNA, but we can have a collection that we can call upon in order to really say, well, what is the difference between all these species? Because you can imagine if I wanted to go and think, well, what's the difference between these closely related oak species? It'd be pretty exhausting if I had to go and check different oak species all the time throughout Canada by traveling. So instead, people over the last several centuries have made collections. They've pressed plants, they've squashed them between sheets of paper until they were dry, and deposited them here at a library called the Herbarium. So in this, the National Herbarium of Canada, we have about 1 million different pressed and dried plants, just like this one on the screen. We put on this label where we collected, who collected it, and the dates. And all of that information tells us that this plant species was collected at this place at a specific time. And it tells us that, well, we know that maybe plants were introduced to an area at a specific time. We can do this with weeds. Or we can say, oh, well, look, some plants are flowering later as time goes on due to climate change. Those are all the things that the herbarium lets us do. Most importantly, they let us make sure that if we say a species is what we say it is, we can go back and check later on because we've kept that specimen. Now, if I took all of the Arctic plants that were found in our herbarium and plotted them on a map of Canada, you'd see that there's a lot more plants collected in the Arctic than maybe you thought there were. Each one of these red dots is a different plant collection. You see that some are maybe located in the middle of the ocean, so we should go check that data. But most of the Arctic is very well collected. But there are also some noticeable gaps. And so that's typically where we go when we go on collecting expeditions in order to fill these gaps. And of course, that's the fun part. It's important to be able to travel to the Arctic to be able to fill in those gaps, but also tell stories about the work that we're doing. So over the last 10 years now, we've gone to several different places all across the Canadian Arctic that you can see on this map here. Sometimes we go canoeing, sometimes we take helicopters, and sometimes all we have are our own feet to take us across the landscape. But it's always a bit of an adventure when we go up. And so we'll get onto our tiny plane and we'll pack it full of all the gear we need to live out on the land for a month. That means we have to bring all of our food, all of our tents, and all of the newsprint in which we're going to press a lot of plants. And that's a lot to put into one tiny plane. Sometimes when we don't have a plane available, we do whitewater rafting. And in fact, in 2012, we rafted down the entire Soper River on Baffin Island. And you can see a photo of that here. So you can save this photo and bring that out when people tell you that scientists have a boring job, because that is absolutely, positively not true. So like any good science, you always have to have a really good team. And so this is our botany team here at the Canadian Museum of Nature. So from left to right, you have Jennifer Dowd, she's our curator, Lynn Gillespie, who's a specialist in Arctic plants, Roger Bull, who coordinates our molecular lab. Right next to him, you have a much younger, skinnier version of me when I started Arctic fieldwork. And then to my right, there's Dr. Jeff Sorella, our current Vice President of Research. And why bring a team? Well, we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and the Arctic is a very big, unforgiving place. It's important to go up with a bunch of people that are going to have your back. So whether or not that's rafting across the tundra, helping you make dinner at the end of a long day, or process all your samples, everyone brings a different specialty to the table, and we have a lot of fun going up together. Now, this is a picture of me collecting up on Baffin Island. You may notice something. How often do you see a scientist that carries a gun around? Not often. And that's because what a very real danger when we're out on the land is polar bears. Polar bears are big, and they may actually attack. We've fortunately never had a problem, but we do carry protection with us when we go up. Of course, the best protection is being smart about it and being very aware of our landscape while we're bending down, collecting lots of different plants. So once we've gone out on our hike and we've collected a whole bunch of plants, we'll bring them back and we'll press them in a plant press just like this. You can see that's what Jeff is doing here. This is a pretty much a state-of-the-art piece of technology since about 1700. So, and I'm sure we've all done it before. We've pressed a leaf in a book. It works really well because once the plant is back here and dry, it lasts hundreds of years in our herbarium. And as you can see, in a typical expedition, we'll come back with a lot of plant collections. And so altogether, that's kind of a really brief overview of what the Arctic is about. And of course, it's really important to remember that while we're up in the Arctic collecting lots of plants and paying lots of attention to tiny tundra flowers, we are often being watched very intently by not only Arctic hares and foxes, but caribou and the occasional very curious Arctic wolf. And so I wanted to say thank you so much for your attention, and I can't wait to talk to you guys all about the Arctic. All right.
Right.
So, perfect.
That was great, Paul. Thank you so much. All right. So guys, we have lots of time for questions. So we'll probably get through at least 2, probably 3 per class. Let's start out with Miss Burke's class. If you guys have a question to kick us off, take it away.
Vas-y, mets-toi la caméra.
You're good.
In English.
Comment est-ce que
Si les changements climatiques affectent la...
How does climate change affect the work that you do?
That's a good question. So a lot of the time, we still don't exactly know what's happening to plants due to climate change because we're still filling in a lot of those gaps in collections. We know a lot about the Arctic, but there's still a lot to learn. Now, some work has found that, you probably saw, I showed you a picture of Arctic willows. Let me bring up one actually while we're talking about that. So I'm going to just bring up this photo. Now, we always make sure to take careful notes about things like heights of willows and shrubs. And if you look up at the top here, you'll see that some parts of the Arctic are very lush. We found that over time, those shrubs are getting bigger and taller. And other people have found that depending on what part of the Arctic you're in, new plant species are coming in, especially invasive weeds in certain parts of the Arctic. So we are, in addition to, kind of documenting what's there naturally, we're also on the lookout for foreign invaded weeds and also things like bigger and bigger shrubs. So I think that's the best way to describe how the Arctic is affecting our research.
Excellent. So more to learn, but what you have learned already is really neat.
Absolutely.
All right, let's head to Miss Saldivar's class. You guys have a question.
Yes. For how long have you guys lived in the Arctica?
Okay. So I actually don't live up in the Arctic myself, but people have been living up in the Arctic for over 1,000 years, since recorded history. Actually, ever since the last glaciations, tens of thousands of years ago. So people have always been living in the Arctic, and it's only been in the last 10 or so years that our group have been working in the Arctic.
Very cool. I always love this idea that people literally crossed over from Asia on an ice bridge to get over here to North America and then move south to South America. Like, what an incredible story of human origins. And we cover those in some of our hangouts too, but very neat. All right, let's go to Miss Burkett's class.
How do I unmute?
You're good. No, you're good.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I have the power. I can mute.
Oh, cool. But this is not, Miss Burkett's not here. Okay. Stand up.
Oh.
There.
Out of all the places, why do the plants pick the Arctic to grow?
Oh, that's a good question. Why do the Arctic plants grow there? Well, plants are really adaptable things. They can grow pretty much anywhere on the planet. And in fact, even in Antarctica, you still have plant species that grow there. And it's because they found ways to adapt to these northern climates. And so actually, I'll show you very quickly. If you look at a typical Arctic plant, and let's pick one of my willow friends because they're right here. So I'm going to bring that up. So these, you notice that in every one of these photos, you can see plants growing. And so let's look at the lower left. It looks pretty barren, right? It almost looks like a bit of a gravel parking lot. But each one of those tiny patches there is actually that's growing to their environment. They grow very low to the ground where it's very warm. All the sunlight is hitting the ground and warming it up, and so the plants like to stay close to that. And they also stay out of the Arctic winds, and that's a good way to stay, you know, kind of cool, warmer in a very cold environment. And a lot of them have also adapted so that they don't need insects to pollinate them as much. They have wind dispersed seeds, but they also they don't need to outcross in order to produce seeds. They can self-hybridize. So that's an important adaptation to Arctic plants too. And I mean, it's there's all sorts of neat different adaptations that let plants grow there. But essentially, once those evolutionary adaptations came into play, they were able to spread across the landscape, and so they've occupied almost every different part of the Arctic.
Very cool. For the classes, just to go a little bit deeper into it, self-hybridization. So this is the idea that if you can't find a mate, you can mate with yourself and produce offspring?
Absolutely. And so, you know, it's really useful if you're a plant in the Arctic and your other plant that you might mate with is very far away. Well, why don't you just produce your own seeds?
Yeah, very cool. All right, let's go to Miss Horner's group.
Okay. All right.
Oh.
I think we're good. Can you hear us?
Yep, you're good.
Go ahead.
Can plants grow on permafrost? Can plants grow on permafrost?
Oh, actually they can. Quite a few plants grow on top of the permafrost. Now, most plants, the permafrost actually is one of the main limiting factors for plants up in the Arctic. You might remember in those photos, nothing was growing very tall. And that's because if you grow tall above the ground, you also need to have very deep roots to keep from toppling over, especially in high Arctic winds. So most plants, Arctic plants have very short roots, and they don't get quite down to the permafrost. They go into maybe the first 10 centimeters of soil, and that's typically thaws out in the summer. But things that do grow on top of the permafrost help to stabilize it. And so that's an important part of the thing too. We see that often in the Arctic now, especially with climate change, a lot of the permafrost is melting and slumping away. And so a lot of plants aren't able to have the same habitat that they used to. Other plant species are really well adapted to this disturbance, this like melting permafrost. And so we see those plants taking over in those areas. So lots of Arctic plants can grow right on top of the permafrost, but not a lot can dig right into it.
Okay. And just for clarification for classes, especially like the one in California, what exactly is permafrost?
So permafrost is, in different parts of the Arctic, it's a part of the soil that stays frozen all year round. So even in the summer, it's a deep layer of soil below the surface that is frozen even in the height of Arctic summer, which can get pretty warm. You can get like 20, 30 degrees Celsius, you know, on a good day. So, but in the Arctic, especially because summer is so short, this layer of soil stays frozen all the time. And as a result, there are lots of different plants that are adapted to grow just above that permafrost.
Outstanding. All right, let's head to Kitchener. And if you guys have a question, go right ahead.
Are there any plants in the Arctic that live in, like, where it's warmer? And do they look different if they feed or grow differently?
Oh, that's a good question. So essentially, you know, do you get warmer parts of the Arctic, is that right? And do you get different plants that are there?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah, so especially in sheltered valleys where you don't have the same kind of wind that goes over, you actually get very tall willow shrubs. And in fact, some places they're up to 10 feet tall. So they are almost like tiny trees out on the tundra. Now, these are small areas because typically the wind and the cold prevent trees from growing very tall in other areas. As climate change affects the Arctic environment, it's going to be interesting to see, do we get more of those little groves of willows? Another thing that we're finding is that especially in communities like Iqaluit and Cambridge Bay up in Nunavut, we're finding weeds are starting to grow in the Arctic, especially around dumps or especially around airports where people from the south are traveling north. And they are able to survive. Not only are they getting a foothold in the communities, but communities do tend to be a bit warmer than the surrounding tundra. And so that's an opportunity for those invasive species to become established up in Nunavut. And so that's something that a lot of people are thinking about in terms of monitoring the Arctic for invasive species.
Cool. All right, let's head to Miss Maxwell's group. You guys have a question?
Hey, takers.
I do have a question.
All right. Can you hear them?
Yep.
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So, how do people live there? It seems pretty cold. Like, how did, people live in the colder climates?
That's a good question. So the question is, how do people live up in Nunavut? And they have lived successfully for thousands of years. Well, so a lot of Inuit have very fond memories of having a more nomadic lifestyle. That's one way that people would have lived. They would have maybe moved around according to seasons and not necessarily lived in communities like now. And of course, there are other ways that you can stay warm out on the tundra, especially in the cold winter, which I think most people don't think about. So, we've got the typical snow house, the igloo. Inside, that's kept warm by things like a seal oil lamp. And of course, hunting and fishing and gathering are all important parts of that lifestyle. And of course, that's rapidly changing for a lot of Inuit now. A lot of Inuit live in communities like Iqaluit, like Cambridge Bay, which I both talked about, like Arviat on the west coast of Hudson Bay. And a lot of these communities are working towards, providing the services that every resident needs. And I think, unfortunately, the history of a lot of the North is actually not, is kind of a dark spot for Canada. We did a few unfortunate things where, so for instance, the community of Resolute was founded by people who were displaced from northern Quebec, unfortunately, and that was a mistake. And the Canadian government has recognized that and has apologized for that. But we're still working to reconcile those problems. So I think that there's, people have lived very successfully for a long time, and I think Inuit are going to live successfully for a long time in Nunavut. I have a good friend, Robert. He's Inuk from Iqaluit. And he told me this once. He said, if my grandmother can go from igloos to iPads, Inuit are going to survive anything. And so I think Inuit are really thriving, especially with additional self-government up in Nunavut.
That is a great quote. All right, let's head for our last question in our first round with Mrs. Wood's class. If you guys have a question, come on. Yes, you're good to go.
What got you into your career of being an Arctic botanist?
No, that's a good question. So what got me into Arctic botany? Well, I always wanted to be a scientist. I think I knew from a young age that I really liked the idea of looking at the world and thinking about, okay, is this closely related to this? And then I kind of realized, through going to university just for a biology degree, that I wasn't really meant to stay indoors. In fact, I don't like being indoors most days during the year. And I realized that something like Arctic botany, where, you know, I would go out in the land, was like, that was an opportunity to get paid to go camping every year, especially in the middle of the summer. Like, hey, I know it's really, you know, they proposed it like this, like, it might be too hard, but how do you feel about going to camp up in Nunavut for 4 weeks just to collect plants? And you know, I mean, inside I was like, oh my God, they're going to pay me to do this. Of course, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I can do that, you know, for the team. No, I think that's what I realized. And I think there are a lot of careers in science that give you that opportunity to be out in the world. And it's not just to do research, but also talking to other people, communicating that science. That's such an important thing too. So I think when I realized I could get paid to go look at plants all day long, that's how I got into Arctic botany.
Outstanding. So it's worth noting, you know, everything you said there has been echoed by a lot of our scientists. It's really nice that, you know, people think of scientists and they think of someone looking longingly at a beaker, and you get to, you know, go on a kayak in the middle of a river in the middle of nowhere, or spend a month camping, right? Like it's such a neat career. Before we go through another round of questions, I just want to note for anyone who's watching on YouTube Live, we have a few classes that we're set to join there. You guys want to write in questions, I will pass them along to Paul, so please do write them in. But for now, let's head back to Mrs. Bork's class. Go right ahead, guys.
What is your greatest skill for finding plants?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed part of that. Could you please repeat it?
What is your skill? What is your greatest skill for finding plants?
Oh, my greatest skill for finding plants. Well, that's a good question. Because out of all of our team, I'm the worst at finding plants, actually. Like, I'm like, oh, this looks green. I know, right? You're like, oh, great, we're getting the D-list botanist. No, actually, I think for me, it's spending a lot of time looking down on the ground and seeing, oh my God, is this different? Is this the same? And it's time consuming. In fact, it takes a lot of time. If you even come hiking with me, it takes a lot of time to go anywhere. Like, I hike really slow because I spend a lot of time looking for plants. And so I think that's probably my greatest skill, is being really slow.
Excellent. And as opposed to D-list, sorry, I actually want to jump on that for a second. One of the assumptions that we get from a lot of students is that people who become scientists were really, really great at science in school and they excelled above everybody else. Can you speak to that really briefly? Just you might have
that was not me. No, so you know what I actually did really well in? My best classes were social sciences. They weren't the hard sciences at all. In fact, I failed math. Especially in university, I failed calculus, which I think most people think about. But you know, it hasn't really held me back. Like, I did have to go back and retake the class because that was a requisite for my degree. But I wasn't the best in terms of math, and I wasn't the best in terms of looking at things and thinking, okay, it's going to take exactly 3.1 liters of this thing to make 2.2 liters of that thing. No, I think every scientist has a very different skill set. And so I think for me as a scientist, you know, I know the things I'm good at aren't necessarily what the rest of my team are good at. But as long as we're working together, I think we fill that in. So for instance, I really like talking to people. I'm an extrovert, and most people think of scientists as introverts. So I like doing things like this, which most other scientists might not enjoy. But, you know, we all work together. And I think that as long as you have an interest in science, you can be a scientist. I don't think that being a scientist means you have a doctorate. I don't think it means that you look at the world one specific way. I think it means that you're out in the community thinking about things critically and then sharing that with your community.
Awesome. All right, let's head back to Ms. Soldivar's class.
Go ahead, we have somebody.
Michael, go.
Go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead, Michael. Michael, go. Michael, say it. Say it. Michael.
He's thinking.
How can you collect plants from the Arctic Ocean?
Oh, that's a good question. So, you know, sometimes they're hard. Sometimes I actually have to go wade into the ocean to collect it. I don't know why it's always me. You know, that comes up again and again. But actually, I have a good friend. Her name is Amanda. She just started here. She scuba dives to collect plants. So she's actually really interested in algae. She's interested in plants that grow underwater. And so she actually is a scuba diver. So she gets all her gear on, she goes diving, and then under the water, she collects the plants to bring them up. So I guess we collect plants in the water by not caring so much about how cold it is.
Just buck up and do it.
Exactly.
We had a question from a group online. So Miss Mitchell's class wants to ask, can you tell us about the amount of light that plants need to grow in the Arctic?
Oh, that's a good question, because you might not know this, but in the Arctic, especially in the summer, it's daylight all day long, all through 24 hours each day. But in the winter, it's dark all the time. And so basically, it's those 6 weeks of nearly continuous sunlight which give Arctic plants the energy they need to grow and to maybe make seeds and to reproduce, because they're going to be lying dormant for most of the year underneath the snow or, underground when they've kind of gone back into their roots. So, 6 weeks of sunlight and then not much more.
Okay. Let's head back to Sterling. If you guys have another question, come on up.
How many plants, which kind of plants do you find the most?
So which kind of plants do we find the most? It depends on where we go, because certain parts of the Arctic are a little warmer, certain parts are a little cooler. And so, different plants are well adapted to those environments. But one kind of plant that we actually found in all Arctic environments are grasses. And so, everyone knows grass, right? Our lawns are made of grass. And that's actually, for most people in North America, that's a species called Poa pratensis. And we call that Kentucky bluegrass. Well, it might shock you to learn that there's Kentucky bluegrass native to the Arctic. It's a different subspecies than the one we plant in our lawns. But grass loves disturbed areas, and lots of different parts of the Arctic are disturbed by wind, by cold, by this permafrost slumping. So you find Arctic grasses all across the Arctic. And so I think that's the one that I find most commonly.
Cool. All right, let's go to Miss Horner's group.
All right. Fine.
The plants that are in the Arctic, are they found anywhere else in the world?
That's a good question. So some of the plants that you find in the Arctic, you can actually find down here. And so sometimes it's the exact same species, and then other times it's just the same family. But my favorite one are willows. And so I probably talked a little bit about willows through this talk. Raise your hand if you've seen a willow tree in your town. And I can see all of you. I know most of you may have seen a willow tree before. My guess is most people in North America live pretty close to a willow tree. And they're pretty tall things, right? Up in the Arctic, they're not. They grow very close to the ground. And that's because it's warmer on the ground. But it's the same kind of plant. It just grows in a different thing that's well adapted to this environment. So there are a couple different plants that do grow outside of the Arctic. By and large, I would say most are pretty confined to the Arctic because it's so cold. But there are always, there's always at least a close or maybe even a distant relative that you'd find in the southern part of North America.
Cool. All right, let's head back to Kitchener. If you have a second question, go for it.
What do you have to study to become an Arctic biologist or botanist? Sorry.
So in my case, what I did was I went and I got my undergrad degree in biology, and then I got a master's degree in biology from a different university. Both of the universities were here in Ottawa. So I went to Carleton University and the University of Ottawa. And actually, Jesse, I noticed at the beginning you called me Dr. Paul Sokoloff. I actually don't have my doctorate.
Sorry.
But I appreciate you conferring one upon me, and I'm going to use it from now on, just so you know.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's most people do think that a lot of research scientists do have doctorates, and there are a lot of people who have very successful careers, both with doctorates, but also you don't necessarily always need one. Sometimes it helps, but in my case, I was very lucky in that I found a position that was required just my master's. And so that's the kind of education needed. There are lots of other people who work in Arctic botany that do have just a bachelor's too, and they have very successful careers. So definitely some sort of university training helps. And that's, of course, me keeping in mind that there's a lot of traditional knowledge about Arctic plants that doesn't come from a university, and that's held by Inuit. And so, you know, I don't want to say that I'm an Arctic botanist just because I have a degree, because Inuit with traditional knowledge are just as much Arctic scientists as I am. They've just come at it from a different path. So I think the common thread there is that we all love plants equally.
I love that message, and I apologize for calling you a doctor. Although I think when you have a master's degree, you should be like introduced as like Master Paul Sokoloff. Like that would work as well.
Oh, I like no.
But yeah, I mean, with most jobs in science and otherwise, if you attain the skills by actually doing the work, you are just as knowledgeable as someone who may have got a degree that's a higher degree. It's really irrelevant once you get up there and you're actually doing the work. So that's a good message. All right, and then we'll wrap up with one last question before we wrap up with Mrs. Wood's class. If you guys have another question, you're good to go. Yep, Miss Wood's class, you guys. Come on up.
Why would you recommend this job to other people?
Ooh, why would I recommend it to other people? You know, I would recommend it to people who really like getting outside and really like, actually, you know, most people, scientists, is kind of like they're at their microscope and they're just focused and they're looking at things. No, I think this kind of job, especially working at a museum where we do have this emphasis on public education, I think you have to want to be able to talk to the public, and you have to want to be able to talk to other people. So that's kind of an important part of it. I would also recommend it just because, I mean, I feel very fortunate to be able to work in the Arctic where not many people are able to travel. And I'd say it's a really important part of the planet to get to know because of its extensive history, because of its unique nature. I think that's why I would definitely recommend somebody to do it. And because I think there's lots of good reasons to conserve that part of the world. I think that's an important reason to get involved.
Outstanding. So before we wrap up officially, Paul, I just wanted to ask one last question, which is for students, is there anything that you can encourage them to do to get more information about the work that you do, about the work the museum does, about science in general? Like, what would you recommend as people might pursue scientific careers and just want to be interested more generally?
I think the best thing to do is to reach out. I've not met one scientist who doesn't like to be asked, what do you do? Who doesn't like to be asked, how did you get there? Most scientists, you just send them an email and they'll either say, oh, you know, I'm really busy, but I'll talk to you tomorrow. Or they'll say, oh, here's everything I know. I'm super happy to talk to you. If you're thinking about a career in science, I encourage you to reach out to somebody whose work you find interesting or whose job you find interesting, because they can tell you what are the different opportunities. They can tell you their path, and they can also share with you that passion for what they do, that's the thing that's going to drive you in your career. And so I would say, don't be afraid to reach out and don't be afraid to talk to people.
All right, so Paul, at the end of every hangout, what we do is I'm going to demute everyone's microphone. So boys and girls, if you guys could get ready to join me in saying a huge thank you to Paul. Everyone is now...
Seriously, thank you all so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Great questions from all the classes. Again, we've got many more hangouts happening throughout the rest of the month, so we hope you'll join you for those. Paul, you're welcome back anytime. That was marvelous, and we appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for this. This is so great.
All right.